Is this some attitude that he's developed that transcends war? Or has he so sort of internalized Japanese values that he doesn't see them as enemies anymore? Welcome to VoiceOver. I'm your host, Heather Bigley, and I talk to people about the movies that made a mark, that led to cinematic epiphanies. And it's not always the movie you'd expect. Today, we're actually talking about Empire of the Sun. It's from 1987, directed by Steven Spielberg. The film is based on a semi-autobiographical novel by J.G. Ballard, whose family was incarcerated by the Japanese in China for about 3 years during World War II. Spielberg cast a young Christian Bale as Jim, who was separated from his parents during the Japanese invasion of Shanghai in 1941, and then spends the rest of the film scrounging up a living in a Japanese concentration camp, surrounded by other British colonials, and ricocheting between the powerful Sergeant Nagata, who runs the camp, and the amoral American Basie, who runs a black market, funded often by Jim's contributions and networking. My guest today is Jenny Chan, who is the host of the podcast Pacific Front Untold. Based in the Bay Area, she's an alum of University of Illinois, and we're going to talk about Asian representation today in these films. Is it possible to do a good job? How successful do you think the film is as this examination of events as they relate to the broader history? Let's start there.
When I first watched it, I was very impressed. I'm like, wow, at least they're telling the story of Shanghai. But then you think about it, there's no Asian civilians, right? There's no Chinese people, even though that they're in Shanghai.
There's the Amma, right? There's just this one character who's Chinese, and she slaps him, which he deserved. I have to say he deserved the slap. But anyway.
And then the Asian identity is then hooked into this enemy imagery. You just think that they're all enemies. And then the Asian face in World War II, it's this Japanese soldier, like what you were saying before, or the kamikaze pilot, or some faceless enemy. And as a coming of age movie, I get it, but then then you have a question of what were British people doing in China? Right? There's no context for that either. And then then the colonial history kind of also disappeared as well. And then also the Wee sisters and the victims are also erased, right? Because then you don't see the other Chinese civilians that were enduring bombings and massacres and whatnot in Shanghai. You see this guy coming of age in Shanghai, and I don't think it did too well in the box office, did it?
No, I don't think so. Well, and I think part of that is, so the character Jim, first Jamie when he's little, and then time passes, he gets called Jim. He has this real fascination with the Japanese pilot, right? And so in 1980s America, I don't think most white audience members were ready yet to have oh yeah, the kamikaze are actually really heroic and cool, and I'm so fascinated with them and I identify with them. And that's part of what we see in the film, regardless of whether or not we're supposed to agree with that. It's certainly portrayed to us through him. I also think when we do see the Chinese, they're either in a crowd trying to escape, right? So we have thousands of Chinese trying to get across the bridge to this certain section of Shanghai, or we see servants, right, or we see sort of people in the streets destitute. And then for the Japanese, what we see is this certain amount of I would say exoticism. There's that scene, Jim convinces these two Americans, come with me back to my house, and there's a bunch of rich stuff that you could have at my house. And he gets to his house, and these Japanese soldiers come out of his house, and they're dressed in these white gauzy kimonos. And so they look ethereal, they look strange. He's terrified of them. And then they get sent to prison. So it's just this, even when we get the Japanese, they themselves are like eroticized, exoticized, and made
Yeah,
strange.
and then
And I don't think that's doing a lot of
like what
favors.
you were mentioning about Amma too, right? Like it perpetrate this Chinese woman stereotype, like this dragon lady
Yeah. Yes.
stereotype. And I think that is also like a misunderstanding of diversity. They kind of put it into
Yeah.
buckets in a way.
Well, let's talk about Sergeant Nagata. So Sergeant Nagata is running the
Yeah.
concentration camp where the British are. And we have several scenes of him. Like there's a kind of a really impactful moment when the the US are bombing the camp. We're watching these pilots fight in the sky, and Sergeant Nagata gets incredibly upset, and he goes to the infirmary, and he wants to like break all the windows in the infirmary. And Jim, seeing that, runs and kneels in front of him, says something to him in Japanese, and then has this incredibly like, I mean, he's like kneeling before him and asking for something. And the sergeant walks away in disgust. And then there's another moment later in the film when a friend of Jim's is going to be beaten by Sergeant Nagata, and Jim does the exact same thing, and this time the sergeant just like throws Jim bodily out of the room and continues to beat his friend. So we have this Japanese soldier who represents cruelty, but also represents like impassive, like we don't know what he's thinking, we don't know what he's saying because they never translate his Japanese for us. Like he's unknowable, and he's like emotionless unless he's angry. I think in the context of your project that wants to show Japanese occupation, this is a really nuanced question. Like what kind of representation of Japanese soldiers should we see in these films that would honestly reflect what was going on?
I think that's actually a very good question. And I was recently reading more of like the rape of Nanking like documents, and some were like, okay, we did see some nice Japanese people who were actually trying to help us, but then that was also overshadowed by like the Japanese brutality of what was happening also in during that time. And it's very hard to say. And like, what if that Japanese guy, what if Nagata wasn't fighting, wasn't managing the camp? Where would he be at instead? I mean, he was a younger soldier. I mean, and I can't, he probably has his own family that he could be building. He could probably be a businessman, or he could probably be doing as well as Jim, but he's probably from a more poor countryside family, and that's why he was recruited to be a soldier to begin with, right? And so I think it's we also need to give background of their upbringing. Like, why can't we get more of a background context of like each character?
Yeah. Yeah. A little more development would help all of us, right? And move into this nuance of who are these people and what are their motivations. One of the things that I've been noticing in these American made dramas about World War II in the Pacific Theater is that there aren't any other Asians in those movies, right? The Asians that we see are Japanese, and they're generally, threatening soldiers, shot in silhouette sometimes. Sometimes we hear them speaking Japanese. They often have no names. So that in itself is something I want to talk about. But I think it's interesting that you have this project that hopes to change mainstream America's idea about the Pacific Theater. So talk to us about your project.
Yeah, so I host Pacific Front Untold, which is YouTube. We're now doing YouTube Live every Tuesday to talk about the Pacific War and also like more untold history. It's actually a part of the nonprofit Pacific Atrocities Education. I started the organization about 12 years ago. I was trying to research my family history and also more modern history of like Chinese history. And it was shocking to me that like 35 million people perished in World War II in Asia, basically. Like, that's like the lower estimate. The higher estimate is like 42 million, and no one really talk about it. And when I'm like watching HBO, The Pacific, or like even The Flags of Our Fathers, it's like about Americans fighting with the Japanese. And so I was like, wow, there should be more to it, because if up to 40 million people perished, we should know more about it. And when my grandma passed away, she was in Hong Kong at the time of World War II. And like after the war, I don't think she really talked about it. Except like after she passed away, we found like a whole box of like items. It included like military yen and rice rationing coupons and whatnot. And so I knew there were like a lot more stories to be told. And but I grew up in the West, so I learned mostly about like Pearl Harbor. We watched like one movie about Pearl Harbor, and then we learned that U.S. defeated Japan, and that's it. And so our goal is to not just tell the story of Japan and the United States, but also a story of Chinese civilians under occupation. Some Chinese were under occupation since 1931, and then also to tell the stories of Filipino resistance fighters, Korean forced laborers, and so-called comfort women, Malaysian and Singaporeans under Japanese rule, and POWs as well, and so many more stories that are like beyond Americans' like imagination. And that's why we exist, to do more research and also change the narrative of World War II in Asia through like books and archival material and digital exhibitions. And now we're doing YouTube Live, and like educational content with lesson plans and such. And so it's not, the mission is not really to say like, oh, here are the terrible things that happen, but it's also to restore the people who were erased from the mainstream narrative. For many Americans, the Pacific War is remembered through like Pearl Harbor, island battles, Iwo Jima, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. But I mean, I'm not saying those are not important, but I think that it's only a part of the story. And our project is really asking about like, what about the civilians under occupation? What the empire looked like on the ground, and who suffered, who resisted, who survived, and who were the one who were remembered. And like many students learn about Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and European theater, but they probably don't know anything about like Japan's colonization of Korea, for example, or the invasion of China, or the occupation of Southeast Asia and the Philippine American War. And so, or like how the Philippines became an American territory.
Yes.
Yeah.
Even if you did learn it, it's really foggy. Like, again, why? Right? Or Hawaii, or like, there's so
Yeah.
many. Yes.
And
There's,
so like when Asian Americans talk about like inherited trauma or like historical memory, and why these like events still matter, I think that a lot of the broader public really lack the context, especially like with mainstream headlines. We want historical literacy. We want people to understand how occupation work, like surveillance, propaganda, forced collaboration, sexual violence, hunger, like biological weapons, and also like to break down ordinary life. I think representation as well. Like Asian American students shouldn't see themselves as like background characters. Like a lot of these movies, the Asian people are just like background characters. I think that they should see their communities as like resistors and also survivors, and also like to keep their memory historically.
what kind of problems do you think this creates when all we see are the Japanese as the only Asian characters in these
I think it
films?
really creates this like invisibility. Like you can't see the other characters. Like I named one movie about the Korean occupied by Japan. Can you name one movie off the
You have to go to Korea to find those films.
right,
So,
that there's only one type of Asian and it's all bundled together, and it also creates to this like invisible problem that we have. Like it's like one or two
yeah.
Japanese guy in these like war movies, and then they get killed, and then that's the end of the story.
I remember there was this moment in a Captain America movie where Captain America goes into like a World War II prisoner of war camp, and there is an Asian person there, and they all think that he's like a Japanese spy, and he says to them,
I'm from Fresno, Ace.
and my husband and I like cheered. Like we were like here is someone who is not what we've just been describing. Here's someone who is not just like a Japanese character of a soldier, and it shows some diversity, and like we were both, just felt like, oh, good. Thank you for making that small, tiny effort, right, Hollywood? Like we appreciate it. I don't know if you've had moments when you've seen some kind of Asian American representation where you go, oh, thank you. Like,
Yeah, definitely. Like lately, I think I have seen more Asian American representation. Like Marvel now has Shang-Chi. I think that was like a superhero. Is not just Captain America.
Well, and something like Minari that got made, which is, like about a Korean American family in the South. And there was recently I think it was a TV show where we looked at each other and we said, oh my gosh, there's 3 Asian characters on the screen and no one is a martial artist. Like, this is amazing. It's very rare to find. When you do find it, you get kind of excited. I want to talk about Jim. If anybody talks about Empire of the Sun in film, they talk about the cinematography, and they often show this scene where the Americans are coming in on their planes and Jim is watching them. We have a crane shot, like to see Jim and the planes in the same shot, and it's highly cinematic, highly dramatic. So he has this sort of reverence, not just for like the American pilots, but certainly for the Japanese pilots. And there's a scene where we watch 3 young pilots do this ritual of becoming a bonsai, and then Jim sings. He's watching them at sunrise. They're going through this little ritual before they get into their planes. And then Jim honors them by singing, this ancient sort of Anglo hymn for them. And it's incredibly moving. And we're supposed to understand, like, Jim is kind of set apart. Is this some attitude that he's developed that transcends war? Or has he, because he's been in this Japanese camp, has he so like sort of internalized Japanese values that he doesn't see them as enemies anymore? He sees them as someone to aspire to.
About that scene, because like from Jim's perspective, I felt like I was trying to be in Jim's shoes. And I'm like, okay, is he looking at these planes like majestic and like almost heavenly? Right? And I was confused. What do you think about that? Like, or do you think that he was having some kind of fantasy? Is he too hungry?
Right. I think there's a couple of things. Like, we know he loves planes. It's from the very beginning of the movie. And he even has this toy Japanese plane that he's kind of flying around. So we know there's an identification, and he wants to talk about the planes with people. By the end of the film, when he's lived in this concentration camp for 3 years, and you're right, he's starving, and the people that have autonomy, the people that have power, and the people that represent freedom are the young Japanese men on the other side of the fence. So all I could come up with was, he's always liked planes. These people represent something that is completely out of reach for him. He wants to identify with them so that he feels some sort of power and autonomy.
Jim is also looking at the war like through this, like, because he really liked planes, so he kind of was looking at this whole war of like the beauty of the airplanes. And so then
it's a fantasy for him. It's like a fantasy scape.
Yeah. And so I think that like it just turned into more of a symbol instead of like living in the real moment, living in the reality. And what's interesting too is that it's in Shanghai, and in Shanghai, the Kodori family built like this Like, if you see the Shanghai iconic bund, like the Kadori family built half of those buildings, and they like were super rich. But somehow their son was also captured in like one of these camps that Jim was also captured in, and like later died in it. But I don't understand why no one like returned Jim to his father. Like, that was the whole, like, I was like, okay, if Jim's like family is so rich, why don't you guys return Jim? I know, I'm
Yes.
sorry. I didn't mean to make light of the situation.
It's okay.
But yeah, I also feel like
Yeah.
in that movie, China is just kind of like a setting. It's not like, you know, the subject, right? And so then you can see these Chinese people, but then like you can't really tell much. There's no character development, I would say.
They're just types filling in the background.
Yeah.
I'm glad I got to talk to Jenny. As you heard, her podcast is a project of Pacific Atrocities Education, of which she is the director. Originally, we had planned to discuss The Pacific, which was developed by Tom Hanks after his work on Band of Brothers and released in 2010. It's 10 episodes about the World War II Pacific Theater told from the perspective of American soldiers. I watched about half of it and found it much darker, more violent, and more sexually explicit than Band of Brothers, but I was really bothered by what Jenny and I discussed here. This is a series about World War II in East Asia, and we only see Japanese soldiers on the screen. This seems like a huge historical inaccuracy, to say the least, but also a real problem for Asian representation, for Asians in America, and for those of us who happen to love Asians in America. So Jenny and I brainstormed a couple of other films, including the 2011 Flowers of War from famed Chinese director Zhang Yimou, starring, coincidentally, Christian Bale, about what is known as the Rape of Nanjing, or the Nanjing Massacre of Chinese citizens by the Japanese in 1937 during the Second Sino-Japanese War. And of course, because it's produced by Chinese and Hong Kong studios, plenty of Chinese folks are on the screen. But it's a hard film to watch because of the brutality perpetuated by the Japanese that's represented on the screen. We talked about also the recent Chinese film, The 800 from 2020. This is about the invasion of Shanghai too. It covers the same historical period as Empire of the Sun. I tried watching it, folks, and I ended up feeling confused. There was not enough context for me, a non-Chinese historian and language speaker, to grasp the complexities of what I was watching. I also struggled with the occasionally inadequate subtitles. And hey, shout out to those who subtitle. I know it's hard work, but just make sure it all matches, right? So that's a lot of what I don't really recommend, and maybe that's okay for this episode. Maybe that helps us understand a little better the challenge of creating a war film. How do you portray events that are too ugly to stomach in a manner so that your audience walks away from the film with a better understanding of the whole history? How do you show heroism without devolving into complete fantasy? How do you show all the different choices that all the different people had to make, those who resisted and rebelled, those who were coerced, those who were exploited, without reducing everyone to victims or villains? Or are victims and villains what make war films palatable for us? That's our show today. Voiceover is a production of BYU Radio and is edited by Spencer Boyer. Thanks to Nick Levitt for additional post-production support. I'm your host, Heather Bigley.